as we're waiting for people to trickle in before the presentation starts, my intention with this is to give a presentation about this idea that I want to share with people, but also as a way to get feedback on the idea and discuss it. I'm fine with discussion during the presentation, and you can feel free to put things in the chat as we're going, and I'll try to respond to them. Also, there's a lot of expertise, I think, on this call among Georgists who are on and sortitionists who are on. And so it's also a great opportunity for me to kind of cross-pollinate these ideologies among these groups that I'm a part of. And I'm really passionate both about Georgism and sortition. And I'm excited to have this discussion with you guys. I'm imagining that my presentation might take about 30 minutes, but if we have questions, it'd be just fine for it to take longer, and then hopefully have some time to discuss at the end. But my the impetus for this talk is just to kind of think about how what's the most effective way to implement sortition or Georgism at a scale and an importance level that it impacts people's regular lives without them needing to join some special club. I think Georgism, as I'll kind of talk about in the discussion, is, I think, a really inherently fair way to organize society. And to me, it's a great synthesis between liberalism, like classic liberalism, and socialism, just because it enables people, all people, to own the earth. And because no one made the earth, I think that's a very just and fair thing to try to do. And sortition, in my opinion, is the appropriate way to scale up democracy rather than elections. And I think it is the true form of democracy when we're talking about scales where people can no longer equally participate in all decisions.
Awesome. Well, I mean, it's 3 minutes past the hour now. So, yeah, Ian, who I guess has already just started his talk. Just to introduce now, Ian is an advocate for democratic sortition, for land value taxation, corporate ownership reform, and intellectual property reform. Very keen on Georgism and sortition, so I hear. He's a lottery-selected board member for Democracy Without Elections, which is a US-based sortition nonprofit, and also a member of Common Ground USA, a US-based land reform nonprofit. Ian holds a Doctor of Nursing Practice and works as a nurse practitioner and an epidemiologist in Idaho, in the United States. And his advocacy is informed by his interest in promoting healthy communities, and obviously his belief in the utility of representative random samples. So Ian, take it away.
Thanks again for giving me the platform to give this talk, and thanks everyone for showing up and being interested and hopefully providing me great feedback and critique on this idea. Okay, everyone's Earth Trust, using sortition and Georgism to reclaim the Earth for everyone, one plot at a time. So all life and civilization depend on nature. A fundamental function of government is basically to secure natural territory and develop rules for allocating its use. Efforts to legitimize the sovereignty of the people, like sortition, must contend with the challenge of securing territory. And so this talk is to think about how should we go about doing that? How should we secure territory and natural opportunities for allowing to support human society? So how could we use the neoliberal world order, the corporate legal tools of oligarchs, and the trend towards privatization to sidestep the challenge of acquiring territory in the name of all people? So just to kind of start off, I want to talk about my values and what I hope to see in a government. So I want a government that ensures equality of opportunity for all, shares nature in a sustainable way that benefits us all, and maximizes personal liberty without infringing on others. And of course, there's lots of complexity to any one of these numbers, but this is kind of a classic liberalism, égalité, fraternité, solidarité type of thing. And my French accent sucks, so we'll just keep going on. So do we have equality of opportunity now? I would argue we definitely do not. There are all sorts of things that influence how someone's life is bound to go that are not in any control of themselves. So income can be vastly different depending on whether or not you have the support from parents that can allow you to get higher education, or connections that would put you into a higher earning position. Wealth, it also follows from that, from inheritance, and then also from gatekeeping natural opportunities, which I'll talk about more. And then health. My background, as Oliver mentioned, is a nurse practitioner and epidemiologist. I'm very interested in public health and how policy impacts people's health. And there's a vast discrepancy in health outcomes, at least in the United States where I live, based on whether or not you were born into a wealthy family or not, or born into a county or a census tract that has high life expectancy or one that has low. And we can with a high degree of accuracy, predict people's life expectancy and health outcomes based on where they were born and what kind of family and wealth situation they were born into. And that to me says that there's a massive opportunity to improve human well-being, and also to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of society. Just because if these sort of outcomes are distributed randomly based on where someone was born, we're not giving people the opportunity to contribute to society that we could in a different formulation. So another question is, are we sustainably sharing the global commons? And I would also argue that we are not, and that there's really no institution that we can trust to govern some of these issues. So, for example, carbon pollution or climate change. Carbon pollution is something that most experts agree is a serious problem. And but from an individual country perspective, a very sensible policy position, which would be like a carbon tax, is politically dead for most countries, because if we tax carbon in our country, what's to say that a competitor country won't tax carbon and will be able to pull ahead of us just due to a greater ability to provide energy to their economy and society. And so it's something that really no institution has the power or the mandate to police, but we all desperately need some sort of control on carbon pollution. Ocean pollution is another similar issue, with microplastics and toxins and giant garbage patches. And I think this is just an important thing to consider. There's really not an effective way that we can police the global commons like the ocean. Similar for toxic waste, orbital debris. So SpaceX may have lots of neat satellites in low Earth orbit, but as those things break down, is there any government or agency or authority that can force them to remove those satellites as they're decommissioned? Or are they going to break up there and cause a bunch of flying shrapnel that will make future space travel and future use of low Earth orbit impossible? Other hazard proliferation like nuclear weapons or AI, and then just kind of the international corpocracy, where large international corporations seem to have a massive influence on international politics through systems like the International State Dispute Settlement System. So how could we get equal opportunity and protect the global commons? I think it's a critical challenge that we try to think about. What are our strategies for trying to get these things? Can we use electoral politics? To a certain extent, I think that we have to, but there's issues with that. Do candidates currently run on equality of opportunity and protecting the global commons platforms? Just speaking as a United Statesian, during the presidential debate between Harris and Trump on the issue of fracking, they were both enthusiastic that we should increase fracking. And if we expect that increasing investment in fracking infrastructure is going to have a 30-year lifespan or something like that, that puts us beyond the 2050 goal of carbon neutral. And so, are people actually running on those platforms? I would say there's not enough pressure to run on those platforms among dominant parties. And we'll talk about why I believe that's the case. Could we run ourselves and win? Could we just run a third-party candidate that's going to do this to have the ideal platform? For myself, I would say that's probably not possible. I don't think I have the money to do so and need to work and care give. And so I think it'd be very difficult for me to stop what I'm currently doing to campaign or to serve, and that's an issue, and we'll talk more about that as well. Is it in interest of first world countries to even the playing field? And that's another complexity. Even if a country like the United States or other quote unquote first world countries have candidates that are running for these platforms, does it have the potential to decrease quality of life or decrease political power for those countries? And I'd say that's possible. Is there an empowered international institution that regular people could trust to take on this work? I would say no. The UN really does not have power, and because of the system of the Security Council, really cannot be trusted to advocate for the people of the world in general. It advocates for the interests of the Security Council. Could we establish a new government? But where to get the land? And how would we defend it if we got land? And how would we grow that so that it could actually advocate for the welfare of all people and not just the small local group that happens to live on the land that we get? So obviously my conclusion is that the electoral path and sort of developing a new country are both really difficult. They're things that are worthy of consideration, but I want to talk about an alternative. Can we clean the earth for everyone, one plot at a time, by aligning people's self-interest with a global sortition-controlled land trust? I'm going to kind of give away my proposal right now and then kind of go more into the background from where these ideas come from. And then we'll have a facilitated discussion. Again, if anybody has any comments or questions we're going through, feel free to stop me or put something in the chat. Okay, so my proposal is a land trust dedicated to buying up land and natural resource rights anywhere and renting to the highest bidders. Required to hold and accumulate assets but not sell them. Open to any person to become a beneficiary for free. Controlled by sortition among all beneficiaries, and which splits the rental income between buying more land resources, so basically reinvestment, and then issuing cash equally to all beneficiaries as restitution for being deprived of free and equal access to land nature. This is basically a real estate investment trust, but with a very different governing and dividend structure. So I want to kind of talk about the philosophy that I feel underpins this distributing rental value or rental incomes of natural opportunities to all people equally. It's called Georgism, named after Henry George, or as some may prefer, geo and urge, from land and labor. Georgism is a lot older than Henry George. Henry George was an economist and political theorist in the mid-1800s after the U.S. Civil War. But it's a lot older than that, and I'll talk about that as well. But the idea is present in cultures around the world that, at least in proto-cultures, the earth was made by no one and so belongs to no one or to everyone. If you want some nature to yourself that is wanted by others, you owe society rent. So rather than a first come, first serve system, Georgism says that you should not be able to claim permanent ownership over land. Basically, as a society, if we want to have equality of opportunity, we would say if more than two people want the same plot of land, then the determining factor might be who's willing to pay a higher rental value. And that the final tenet here is basically Georgism aims to eliminate the unearned benefits from gatekeeping nature or locations, leaving people the full value of their work, but nothing more. So how does the land value tax work? So basically, land value taxes make all the people the landlords of all the land. The rental income goes to society. So first to cover government spending, and that might be a socialized healthcare system or utilities or whatever. And then whatever's left over is split evenly between all people in what's called a citizen's dividend. This is very similar to the universal basic income concept, but where UBI, and functionally it's essentially the same, but UBI is often thought of as a welfare program. This is thought of as a dividend, as people's right because of their equal ownership of the earth. And so basically people are yeah, this is going to all of society rather than into any private landlords. So in a Georgist situation, the cost per square foot of land would go up depending on the market, or how many other people also wanted to use that space. So rural places would have really low cost per square foot. Urban places would have higher cost per square foot, just like it already is. So if you can imagine every bit of nature being for rent by a private landlord, and where, different costs for different square footages of land depending on its location and the resources that are present there, except that there's no private landlord. The private landlord is everyone. So I would say that there's an inherent justice in this, because equal ownership of nature is really necessary for equality of opportunity. If no one's effort made nature, allowing private ownership of nature gives the owner an unearned advantage over everyone who comes after them and also wants to use that land or nature. This is just a chart showing support for reducing economic inequality and ensuring equal opportunity among OECD countries. The orange there is the OECD mean, and then you can kind of see among all OECD countries, the support ranges from 60% to basically like 90%. So political support for this idea, for this type of idea, is very high. Allowing unlimited individual ownership of nature is inconsistent with rights to the fruits of one's own labor, and I would argue is also inconsistent with rights to one's own life. And Henry George made an excellent case for this in his book, Progress and Poverty, and I'm going to share a quote from that book. Place 100 men on an island from which there is no escape, and whether you make one of these men the absolute owner of the other 99 or the absolute owner of the soil of the island will make no difference either to him or to them. In the one case as the other, the one will be the absolute master of the 99, his power extending even to life and death, for simply to refuse them permission to live upon the island would be to force them into the sea. And that might seem dramatic, but there are real life examples of this essentially happening. I would say a piece of history that I'm familiar with is like the enclosure movement in Europe, and then what that ended up doing to Ireland with the Irish potato famine. My ancestors moved from Ireland like 4 generations ago due to the Irish quote unquote potato famine. But during the Irish potato famine, Ireland was exporting food to other countries, and actual gross food production was very high. The reason that people were starving to death, Irish citizens were starving to death by the millions, is because the land did not belong to them, but belonged to absentee English landlords as well as Irish landlords that held the land out of use. Because as international markets developed, it became more profitable for people to grow sheep and other low labor input crops rather than allow serfs to continue to work the land. And so basically the English military had soldiers posted in Ireland to secure the routes from these landed estates to the ports to allow food to get shipped away from Ireland, and people had nothing to eat and starved by the millions. And so this is literally something that has happened historically, and Ireland is of course not the only example. Okay. So beyond equality of opportunity and just the justice argument, land value tax has some other economic benefits. So it improves efficient land use, like the YIMBY movement, Yes in My Backyard movement, is really focused on this, and some YIMBY advocacy organizations in the United States that I'm familiar with, like Strong Towns, also argue for essentially land value tax, because if people are charged by the square foot, they don't want to claim any land that they're not going to use. And so sprawling suburban yards don't make sense if you're not using that land. And so it tends to increase the density of development, which also decreases the financial burden of a municipality on paying for roads and utilities, because every inch of someone's yard is another inch of pipe and electrical conduit and asphalt and sidewalk to go that much further to get to the next person's house. And so it decreases costs for municipalities. It also tends to decrease the impact on the environment, just because it tends to decrease how sprawled out humans are and all of the energy inefficiencies that come with that. It does, unlike other taxes, it doesn't decrease productivity. So a concept for certain types of taxes is deadweight loss. where if you tax a thing, you tend to get less of it if it's elastic. So if I'm taxing food, for instance, and there's a bunch of people that want to buy an apple, but there's a 5% or a 10% tax on food. The person that doesn't have, and apples are $1 or something. I know that's not the right price, but if apples are $1 and someone only has $1, then they're not going to get the apple, even though they would want it. So that deadweight loss decreases how much people are able to sell and how much people are able to buy. And ultimately, that sends signals back to the producers to say, make less apples. People can't afford them. Land value tax doesn't do that because you can't make less land. And then because under a full land value tax, which means that the land value tax captures the full rental value of that land, there's not any left over. There's no benefit for individuals to gatekeep the land and hold it out of use to sell at a later date. So the housing supply and the number of jobs tends to increase, which would make housing prices go down and wages likely go up. Because if you're not going to use the land and there's no speculation benefit, you're going to sell that land to someone who's willing to either put a business on it so they can get income stream from the business, or someone who's going to put housing on it and get income stream from maintaining the housing. So as far as endorsements, the history of land and the history of it, land value tax, the idea is very old. It was formalized, at least to my knowledge. I think there are some examples of like even ancient, like Indian philosophers writing things about this. But as far as like in Western society, Thomas Paine is one of the earliest endorsers of a land value tax. He wrote this pamphlet called Agrarian Justice. He's the guy down here in the lower row middle. Land value tax and Georgism were also endorsed by these other historical figures. So Henry Ford located his plant in Detroit, at least partially because Detroit happened to have a land value tax at the time. Leo Tolstoy, Martin Luther King, Winston Churchill, the economist Friedman and Stiglitz, Friedman being a kind of neoliberal Reaganite type economist, and Stiglitz being a socialist economist. Albert Einstein, Helen Keller, as I mentioned, Thomas Paine, the sci-fi author Aldous Huxley, and then Lizzie McGee, who was the inventor of the board game Monopoly. She invented it as the landlord's game. And Parker Brothers basically stole her idea, cut out the half that explained what Georgism is, and developed. And that's what the game Monopoly that we play today is, a basically castrated version of what she had developed. So with all of those influential people supporting the idea of land value tax, why haven't we implemented it? So this gets to the trouble with elections, and Georgists have wrestled with this problem. Not all of them may be aware of what I feel is the solution, which is sortition. But the trouble with elections is that they tend to elevate people who are they have less of a need to work. And that tends to concentrate the proportion who are able to earn income from gatekeeping nature or gatekeeping other natural opportunities like landlords. And it's very difficult for people to see the injustice of something by which they gain income or wealth. And so whether it's corrupt or not, it's certainly, if you have a high proportion of decision makers who are landlords, you are less likely to harm your own interests by instituting a land value tax. So the remedy that I believe is what's called sortition. And sortition is a very old concept. It harkens from ancient Athenian democracy, and it's basically using random selection to determine decision makers rather than elections. So elections are the wrong way to scale up democracy. Elections result in a very skewed population of decision makers, which I've already kind of talked about. People who are have less of a need to work or caregive are more able to run. People who see themselves as suitable for making decisions on behalf of other people are more likely to run. And so just from the very start, the pool of people who are interested in running for political office tends to be a highly biased population that has an increased proportion of narcissists, sociopaths, and rentiers. So random sampling gets a small enough group to deliberate without skew. So elections, as I indicated, they produce all sorts of skew in wealth and personal characteristics, whereas random sampling does not, and that's why we use it in empirical science and epidemiology. And so I'm going to go through some common criticisms of sortition. So, don't you need expertise to govern? Helene Landmore has this excellent quote: "Experts should be on tap, but not on top." We should have access to expert advice and expert insight into complex topics, but expertise itself can sometimes be distortionary, and there's examples of that in my field of public health as well, where, for instance, first world countries introduced vaccination programs for third world countries, and by mistake, introduced like widely spread hepatitis C amongst sub-Saharan African countries by reusing syringes and whatnot. Their experts are not omniscient, and sometimes having objectivity and deciding how things are implemented is really important. Experts should be on tap, not on top. Another metaphor is, should the passengers get to decide on the destination or just the pilot? Basically, in my opinion, the passengers should decide on the destination, and then they hire the pilot for their expertise in getting them where they want to go. Next concern, won't you get corruption of the randomly selected folks? Of course, that's possible. But just like you might get corruption of elected politicians, there are ways to deal with that. So we can have short terms, especially for the groups that make decisions about which legislation should go in place and whether or not executives get to stay in office, having really short terms so that we're not changing the population that's actually making these decisions. We can also divide functions, like drawing large representative samples for short periods to decide on the procedural rules for governing, decide on what the agenda should be, generate proposals and draw proposals from society to put before the decision-making bodies, and then finally choosing among those proposals for what actually becomes law. In addition, the randomly selected bodies should probably evaluate executive staff to ensure that the experts, the people who are executing the policy that the people have chosen, are doing their job and acting in fair and reasonable ways. So back to my proposal. So the proposal is a land trust dedicated to buying up land and natural resource rights anywhere and renting to the highest bidders. Required to hold and accumulate assets but not sell them. Open to any person to become a beneficiary for free. Controlled by sortition among all beneficiaries, and which splits the rental income between reinvestment, buying more land and resources, and then issuing cash equally to all beneficiaries as restitution for being deprived of free and equal access to nature. So possible benefits. And I tend to have delusions of grandeur when it comes to these kinds of things. So bear with me as I indulge in that, and then we can kind of have a more realistically grounded discussion about it. So I think this sort of land trust could effectively spread the ideas of land value taxation and sortition to more people. I think a problem for both of these movements is that very few people are aware of what they are or that they exist as possible political options. And this would basically give people free money to learn about these ideas. In this scenario, so in this proposal, every dollar donated and every hour volunteered directly brings us closer to sharing the earth with everyone. I think certainly political activity is needed, and I personally am strongly in favor that we need constitutional reform basically at every level of government that has a constitution to make sortition the default way that we scale up democracy. But political activities have risk of failure, and so you may sink a lot of money and time into something that ends up failing politically, whereas this, every dollar, every hour, it usefully gets us toward a goal. So helping for this won't necessarily get you on a CIA or FBI watch list. I can't promise that it wouldn't get on an IRS watch list. And sorry, I'm using United Statesian agencies. I'm just less familiar with international ones. But thinking about dramatically altering constitutions of governments is something that there's a history of, like, the global hegemony getting its fingers into and trying to disrupt, whether that's the United States CIA or FBI or other groups. So the land value trust would establish a common interest among potentially all people and a channel for political coordination among them. Unfortunately, many political coordination avenues are controlled by large corporations. Like, for instance, we are currently meeting on Google. And if Google decides to use AI to determine what we're talking about and prevent these types of discussions, I think it would technically be possible for them to do so. Not that they would want to do it at this time, but in the future it may be possible, or to restrict political discussion on these types of platforms that are entirely controlled by for-profit private corporations. It could also establish a solid basis via the reliable demand to pay rent for fairer, independent currency or credit systems. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but political theorists or economic theorists like Proudhon and Giselle have ideas that the current way that most governments issue money is deeply wrong, and that's why people, for instance, pay an unending, like, dividend to private stockholders for a company for a limited amount of capital. It does not make sense that people would agree to pay an unlimited amount of dividends or unlimited amount of continued private benefit from them, giving a limited amount of capital to a company. So why do people take that bargain? Why don't we have more worker co-ops? Why is the landscape dominated by these stock ownership companies? And Proudhon and Giselle had interesting thoughts about why that's the case. This land value trust could also create a mechanism for sharing wealth from unearned opportunities equally with all people, reversing globalization trends where natural resources and wealth are often extracted from third world countries and sent to first world countries, who then, their service economies are able to better take advantage of those things, and they grow wealthier while poor countries stay poor. Okay, some anticipated criticisms or questions. So where will the money come from for this thing? Well, of course, from the injustice of private property of the earth, location, and natural opportunities. Rent. Rent is a income producing asset that does not require work. And so once you start, this sort of land trust would need some startup money to buy a piece of land. Where I live in Idaho, there's land that's relatively inexpensive, that doesn't have a lot of structures built on it, but that is leased out to ranchers or farmers for them to use. And so having a piece of land like that could start this off, and then could slowly snowball as you're getting rent from people who are renting from you. And then another possibility is donations or the wills of like-minded people donating to this land value trust. This is more questionable, but I think there's a possibility that this could be what's called a 501c3 in the United States. And that is a nonprofit charity that has distinct tax benefits in the United States. So in the United States, people can donate a certain amount of their tax burden. Instead of paying taxes with this money, they can donate up to what's called the Schedule A maximum to a private nonprofit charity in lieu of paying taxes. And so basically they have no financial harm to themselves, and they're able to divert money that would go into the public coffers into something that they personally feel that it should be donated to, which a nonprofit charity of some kind. So it's a really effective way to increase how much you are able to fundraise. And then it also makes the organization more tax efficient, because you don't have to pay any federal and in many cases state taxes as well. So why don't you just make rent cheaper for your renters? Aren't renters suffering enough? Well, so this has essentially been tried by other land trusts, and my argument is that it can't solve the global scarcity of land for renting or for businesses. It's only a Band-Aid. Band-Aids are useful, but we're trying to do something else with this. So there are examples of Georgist land trusts like Arden, which is famous, which failed to fix housing scarcity and thus make land sales cheap because they didn't capture the full rent for the public. So basically the people living there were able to capture the value of their location, and that drove up the transfer price or the sale price of their parcels of land and their homes. And so houses and land in Arden, which is still essentially a Georgist commune, sells for pretty comparable prices to areas around it because the full rental value is not captured for the public. So private people are able to capture that and get it in the sale price. So another question, why let anyone get restitution? Why not just the renters? So the idea, this is a criticism that I've had from other Georgists that I've talked to, or, at least some Georgists have brought up this concern with me. So the renters don't make their location valuable. The whole community around them makes their location valuable. From the metro station that connects them to other parts of their city, to the bakery or the coffee shop or the job opportunities that are nearby. The value of a location is based on how many other people also want that location and not necessarily just what an individual did. And for this trust, I want the incentives to be to expand and capture the full rental value. And that won't happen if the renters are the only beneficiaries and controllers, because they'll tend to just want to lower the rent. And that's one of the reasons that for why Arden hasn't done that. Another concern, if anyone can sign up, won't all your income go to transaction fees and administration? If you have a small amount of land and have 9 billion beneficiaries, how are you not just going to lose all your money on transaction fees to credit card companies or PayPal or whatever? So we can fix the percentage of income that goes to administration. For example, like have 50% reinvestment, 40% restitution payments, and 10% administration. And then by doing that, we can basically issue restitution to a subset of the beneficiaries in terms. So 1 year you might issue restitution to group A, next year group B, just to keep the overall transaction number and the transaction costs low to stay within the allotted administration percentage. But isn't it wrong to extract the value from local communities and then send it out all over the world? Yes, but isn't that what our society is doing to third world countries currently? With global trade, the value of most communities is really already created by people all over the world, in my opinion. And we saw that happen during the pandemic when supply chains went down. One way, and this is an appeal to people who are really concerned about illegal migration, which I think is a concern that should be discussed, but one way to prevent like the crushing migration that sometimes occurs in countries without violently keeping people out with razor wire and machine guns is to basically level the unearned advantages of location of birth with a global citizen's dividend. So basically, if no location would be more economically preferable to any other for the average person, then there's not an economic reason for people to migrate. And of course, most people would rather stay in their communities where they understand the language and they have social support from families. I could say that's definitely the case for myself in considering emigrating to another country. Should the earth really belong to everyone? Why not just let U.S. citizens join as beneficiaries? The U.S. military secures the world for everyone's benefit after all, right? So another thing, another point of Georgism is most wars are waged to capture natural territory for economic benefit. If we think about, Israel's interest in the Gaza Strip and Russia's interest in parts of Ukraine, wars, even though people think, oh, it's a digital world, it's not about natural resources, conflicts historically and currently are almost always about natural territory and about the economic benefit that natural territory and natural opportunities provide. So if we are able to take that unearned benefit away, most wars would become superfluous, at least in my humble opinion. We already live in a singular global society if we consider supply chains. And if we don't share the unearned benefit of where we were born, it's my opinion that we're no better than feudal lords keeping people in the third world as serfs. By sharing the land rents, differences in income will better reflect skill and work ethic rather than just the chance of birth. Why prevent the trust from selling land? Well, basically, if there's no way to sell land, there would be no way to capitalize on the increase in value other than to have it used. And at least economically, that's ideally done with the shortest leases possible while maximizing profit. So we want to prevent having land held out of use and contributing to the problem of landlords artificially keeping land value, housing prices, rents artificially inflated during downturns. Won't governments just stop the trust or take back the land? The neoliberal world order already defends the private property rights of corporations with government monopolies on violence. Basically, this defense of private corporations extends within the borders of unwilling countries via mechanisms like the International State Dispute Settlement System, the World Bank, IMF, etc., where sometimes private corporations are able to sue sovereign countries because their investors did not get the full benefit of, for instance, exploiting a coal mine or some other fossil fuel after climate change, legislation is passed in private companies or private countries. Basically, to stop this land trust, governments would likely need to take broader action against corporations in general and thereby the hegemony, which I think would be very unlikely. Won't people work politically to force their governments to stop a private corporation extracting unearned wealth from their communities? Private landlords are already doing this. Private landlords extract rent from communities and then send it all over the world or do whatever they want with it. And people have basically been unable to stop them so far. And if people do unite against this trust, they could be shown that landlords in their community are already doing the same thing, and the movement could be broadened to stop the injustice of private ownership of land and nature generally, which works towards my goals anyways. But the whole earth isn't for sale. How can you continue to grow once people will no longer sell? If no other land was for sale, this trust would be massive. In that scenario, a significant portion of the global population would likely be beneficiaries of this democratic trust, would know about sortition and land value taxes, and would have the coordination mechanisms via the trust to advocate for real political change. Again, to get into my delusions of grandeur, the end game here would be to have a more economically fair earth with people connected and familiar with the idea of land value taxation and Georgism, and able to advocate then for real political change. So that's the end of my presentation. I went a little bit longer than I expected, but I really appreciate you guys staying on and listening, and I'm open for any questions that you have.
Thanks a lot for that, Ian. Wayne, could you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. Yeah, great talk. We'll take questions from the floor. You can raise your hand with the little raise hand button at the bottom of the screen there. We got a raised hand from Benny. Benny, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, I can do that. It was a great presentation, Ian. I also see a lot of similarities to money versus land. It's sort of the same thing in my view. And one of the things you have seen with money is that you inherit money, and this sort of keep the system as it is. So one of the things you can do is basically that you cannot give land to your son or your daughter by law. I'm just giving this as an extra in some ways that would really benefit this sort of system in a very short time.
Yeah, I mean, good point. Yep. Thanks a lot, Benny.
Peter in the chat says, brilliant presentation, great breadth of vision.
Thanks so much.
Do we have another question? Rich, go ahead.
Well, what's a very practical first step, Ian?
Great question. So Common Ground USA is a 501c4 in the United States that has it's a Georgist organization with a decent sized war chest. And so the first step might be to say, hey, I have a grant proposal. I'm asking for $10,000 to buy a plot of land in rural Idaho to pursue this sortition-controlled earth trust. And then once you're able to get like the first $10,000 or so, it would be, you could buy some land that has a rental value. At least where I live, where at least in some rural areas, the rental value of bare land is low enough that you could start with a small amount of money. And then from that small plot, start gaining rental income and building up the organization from there. I think so that the first step for me is, the next step for me is to talk to a lawyer, to have them go over a business plan, to talk to an accountant, and then potentially make a pitch to organizations like Common Ground USA for donations, and then getting a couple $1,000s to start with, and that would be enough to start snowballing the organization from there.
Wayne has a question.
Yeah, I just want to build on Rich's question, Ian.
Wayne, you're very, very quiet.
Can you not hear me?
We can. It's like you're at the bottom of a well.
You can go ahead. If you can't fix it, I can hear you well enough, Wayne, and I'll repeat it.
I think it. Let me just play with this just for a second. Oh, I think. All right, how's that? Is that better now?
Much better, thank you.
Much better, thank you. Okay, sorry. Is this Google Voice? Is that, or Google Meet or something? Is that what we're on here?
Correct.
Yeah,
correct.
This is why we hate Google Meet. I want to follow up on Rich's question. So, Ian, I thought it was a terrific presentation. I've been curious about this. I actually have two questions, but the first one is just building on what Rich said. So if you're trying to expand this, if you start, let's say you get 10K and you can buy this piece of land and you can get going on this. In order to expand this, you're going to take your income and buy more land. You're not going to distribute it to everybody in the world, right? So this is a practical, right? So it's a practical thing. You're just going to keep growing this. You're never going to give anybody any money. You're just going to make this thing larger and larger. Yes? Am I understanding that right?
No, not necessarily. My idea would be to split it. This would be in the bylaws, but say 50%.
Wayne, turn off your mic.
Yep.
Like Wayne, you got to like either mute yourself all the time you're not speaking, or put on some headphones, because we're getting this crazy feedback loop.
Sorry. Thanks, Wayne. Great question. So no, the idea would be to start giving these payments immediately, and so in the bylaws, my idea would to have some percentage which is designated for reinvestment, and another percentage of the income that is designated for these restitution payments. And so, from the get-go, it would be up to the sortition selected board on what that proportion would be. But, they have, as the board, they would have interest in both expanding the holdings of the organization, as well as getting rental income themselves. So I think there's a good push and pull there to say, we want to expand the holdings. We want to have a certain percentage that's going towards buying more natural opportunities. And then the whatever's left over is going to administration and restitution payments.
All right, just turning on for 1 second. Can you put some references? I came here late and I maybe missed some, but just so that I can understand some of the concepts better. What do you recommend? Are there websites or books or articles, just to get a quick grasp quickly?
Absolutely. So I'll post a video in the chat, just kind of a Georgism primer if you're interested in viewing that. And Progress and Poverty by Henry George is, an economics text from the 1800s. And so it's not the easiest thing to read, but it's where it's the formal way this is laid out. There's lots of newer updates to that, like Land is a Big Deal by Lars Doucette, which is a relatively new book about land value taxation. Lars Doucette also did a presentation on the Asheville Codex podcast about that. So if you look up Lars Doucette or Progress and Poverty, you'll find more of these things. And then Arden, Philadelphia is another interesting case study for a similar thing, but not the same thing. I'll post a couple videos in the INSA Discord. Maybe I'll make a thread on there just so that those who are interested can follow up and learn more about where I'm coming from.
Great. We got Lance, and then we got Chloe.
Yeah, thank you. It was an excellent presentation, as everyone has been saying, and I heartily agree. It must have been like 30 years ago, somebody handed me Progress in Poverty. And so I read through this. Yeah, I'm dating myself, huh? And you were maybe, what were you, 10? Anyway, I first kind of dismissed it as no, this is too simple, and it's ignoring what the Marxists would call the relations of production, which I still think is a problem, although I believe sortition helps with that. So the two hand in hand, I can see each one ameliorating the others, or you know, a synergistic combination. My one dilemma or question, I guess, still is as wages increase in an area like, say, San Francisco, rents go up, and this is what George saw, and so you know, they capture all the wealth. But conversely, if rents go down, which they would with the land value tax, wouldn't wages also go down? And if you're distributing that money, basically it's like a UBI, that's an inflationary. So are we ahead of the game in the end? I've tried to find this addressed, and I haven't seen anyone address it, which is strange because I'm sure it's people other than I have thought of it.
I'll do my best to answer them. So if rental values are going down, there's a couple reasons that rental values could be going down. So actual land prices could be going down, in which case, you know, we would expect that might be caused by loss of population. People are moving out of the area or dying faster than they're being born, or whatever. So if economic productivity of an area is going down, then yes, absolutely, land values and rental values are going to go down, and so is income for workers. If, however, the rental values are going down by the land value tax, that doesn't necessarily mean that wages would go down, only because it's basically distributing. It's still capturing the full rent, but instead of distributing it to a private landlord, it's distributing it to society. So you're right that rental values, if they are going down in absolute terms, it probably does mean that wages are going down. But under Georgism, rental value is actually not going down. It's just going to a different person. It's instead of going to a private landlord, it's being distributed to society. And so under a Georgia system, it's still beneficial if rents go up, but you're going to be your income tax, your sales tax, all these other costs are going away. And so the worker benefits, and the worker also directly benefits from the citizen's dividend as well. Does that answer that question?
Maybe. So you're saying the rents in San Francisco would not go down; they would remain high.
Correct.
But the tax would redistribute it, and would the redistribution be throughout the country or just to the local?
Great question. Georgists disagree on this point, on whether it, you know, how much of the location value should be reinvested in the community that, of course, is paying for that infrastructure, and how much should be distributed globally with everyone on Earth. The land trust that I'm proposing does not have an elegant mechanism to distinguish between those two. And so for simplicity's purpose, I just said it should be distributed to everyone on planet Earth. But yeah, I think there's a lot of important discussion about where the division should really be. But yeah, for this, you know, relatively crude propaganda tool that I'm envisioning, it goes to everyone on Earth.
Okay, thank you.
Chloe, your turn.
Thank you. So in my area, there's an organization called the Teton Regional Land Trust, which is a group that seeks to basically encourage private landowners to establish conservation easements on their private property. And I wonder if you think that that kind of an organization is a step in the right direction towards the Georgism model, or if you think that that is something that is further encouraging private property in the context of like public use.
I think it is beneficial for society, but I think it is more of a band-aid than it is addressing the underlying inequity or inequality of distributing land rents. I think it's potentially helpful for the environment. It's helpful for the public as they might have more publicly accessible lands. And so I think organizations like that are great. I think ultimately, I still think it's not like the solution that I want, but it's a great policy that I'm supportive, or a great effort that I'm supportive of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Martin, and I think this is going to have to be our last question as we're coming up on the hour.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much, Ian. I thought it was a fantastic presentation, and it was really cool to also learn more about sortition. And it seems like this could be really, really useful to combine these ideas. I was wondering, so I've thought a little bit about these ideas, and if anyone is interested, I'll send a link in the chat where you can read more. So in the final chapter. But I think one difference I've thought about is particularly distributing these rents to the residents of the area, not for the reason that they are more entitled to it, but rather because that would create an economic incentive to become a resident of these areas, which would sort of bootstrap development and enable these places to develop or grow much more quickly. Do you think that there's any way to still have that type of effect while combining it with the sort of global opt-in version or the sortition version?
I haven't been able to think of a creative way to do that, and that's why I ultimately, as a propaganda tool, it's more useful to me as if anyone can join from anywhere. But you make an excellent point that a lot of those like non-justice related benefits of land value taxation that I talked about, economic efficiencies, are best realized at a local level. Because land value taxation, there's good evidence that it's going to increase economic productivity and economic efficiency in an area, make it a more desirable place to live, and that's going to have important snowballing effects for the people that are living there too. That, I would really be open to more ideas about how I might incorporate that, or whether that should just be a different sort of land trust. These could be separate organizations. I think any effort that's going to spread the idea of land value taxation and sortition, I think is a really important win. And because right now, I think the biggest failing for both of these movements is that so few people are aware of them. And I think if we increase awareness for more people, we'll be moving in the right direction, whether we get that politically or privately with a land trust.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Ian, for that fantastic talk. Thank you to all our questioners and everyone who's attended. It's great to see you all here. Hopefully, we will see you again. Our next presentation is going to be in January. It's going to be Ben Redhead. He's going to be doing a follow-up to a sortition in organizations presentation last year, which is very interesting. His plan essentially is to introduce people to the idea of sortition via implementing it in organizations, so in business organizations and the business context. So that should be really interesting. Yeah, thank you all for coming, and yeah, hopefully see you soon.